Hello, welcome to Cerulean Arts Gallery. Tonight we're speaking with Lou Schellenberg and Gene Shaw in conjunction with their exhibition, Poetic Transformations, on view now through November 24th. Hello, Gene and Lou.
Hi.
Good evening.
Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, indeed. Lou and I have shown together at the same gallery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Lancaster Galleries for a good number of years. And our paths also crossed up in Maine. And that's probably the first time I saw Lou's work and then realized that she was from Lancaster. And so we finally met. And then we ended up showing at Lancaster Galleries a number of times. And our work sometimes hung together. We ended up liking each other's work. It looked well together when it was hung on the wall. And we got the idea that maybe we should have a show together. And we discussed the possibility of maybe having a show in Philadelphia. And since I had shown at Cerulean Gallery a number of times before, that's when we approached Tina and Michael about the possibility of having a show.
So is this your first two-person show together?
Yes, this would be the two, yeah. And hopefully it will be the first and we'll have many more.
Yes, indeed.
So
So maybe Gene, you could tell us a bit about like your background and like where your work comes from, your assemblage.
my I went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in the late 60s and came out as a printmaker. I did black and white woodcut prints for years. And about 3 years after leaving the academy, I went into business for myself in a construction business, restoring old houses, doing cabinet work, millwork. And I did that for almost 35 years. When the housing debacle happened in '08, I got my tools out and started doing prints again. And shortly after that, I had been in a couple shows. I'd won an award and had a gallery in Lancaster and another gallery in Deer Isle, Maine. And it just kind of morphed from there. When I retired, it made an easy transition in from my woodworking and back into my art. And I started using not a lot of things, but a few things that I had collected over the years, various pieces of metal or wood that had either interesting shapes or colors. And so I worked on, I have a source, 3 people in Maine who are pickers and pick stuff out for me. When I decide that I need a certain thing, that they go on the lookout for things. And when I go to Maine this summer, I pick things up. And Maine is also a big source of my inspiration.
The landscape.
Well, the landscape and just the architecture and whatever, because I was working on old houses for so many years. I love the Maine houses where the house and then it goes into a shed and then it goes into another shed and then it finally goes into a barn. Those elongated houses that just seem to go on forever. And I just and the period of houses, a lot of those houses were built in the 1840s, and I just love that kind of. And they were all painted white. It's like triple white. The siding was white, the doors are white, the shutters are white, the sash are white, everything's white. And I really like that because you see all the shadows and things. And so a lot of that collected stuff comes from Maine. It also comes from dumpsters. people save stuff for me. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. Um, so now that I'm retired, I've gone back to my art pretty much full time. That's where I'm at. I'm having more shows. My work has progressively gotten better as I work at it full time rather than just kind of piecemeal. And so kind of the latest result of my things, some of the things you're seeing on the slides right now, were just done in the last 3 or 4 months. So, and I consider some of those things some of the better things I've done in the
Well,
last.
great, thanks, Gene. So we'll talk more about the work itself. But Lou, can you tell us like your story?
Oh, well, as Jean said, we met in Lancaster, and I came to Pennsylvania to teach. I moved here from New England for a teaching job, so I'm very much from New England, and especially um, love Maine, and have spent several decades in Nova Scotia, going back and forth between Nova Scotia and Maine and Pennsylvania. So, my work starts with the landscape, and I've been painting plein air, like outside, for decades now. But because I taught, I've done a lot of other things in the past. I started out, went to art school in Boston and was a printmaker, and then I did a lot with watercolor and even some sculptural tangents occasionally in the past. But I've always come back to the landscape, and it's interesting to hear Jean talk about the architecture in Maine, because most of my work uh, has dealt with architecture, and I just love being outside and painting uh, like structures in the landscape. Um, and I guess I've been doing that now for a few decades. And I've retired from teaching in, I think, 2012. And I've had a lot more time to work and more time to travel. And this summer, I went up to Newfoundland for the first time, and that was pretty extraordinary. Um, and yeah, I mean, what else? What else can I say? Um,
Well, looking at the both your work, there's like a strong like geometric thrust to it. It seems. Can you guys talk about that?
I um, for me, I've just always been drawn to architecture in the landscape, or buildings in the landscape, and I think that's what interested me in Jean's work also, is these geometric um, forms that relate to um, the land also. Like these paintings started as plein air paintings, so this was actually a landscape with a house in it, and then it got reworked in the studio.
Because it seems like you're boiling things down to like a shape state that you're not trying to be, naturalistic.
Yeah, these are very synthetic or abstracted and flattened. Um, my other plein air work is not all like this. Some of my plein air work is much more naturalistic, and the colors are a little more tonal. These are all very high key colors for me. Um, but it was just fun to be free to rework these plein air paintings, and play around with the shapes, um, and I think I think what drove the compositions and the colors was really just this emotional reaction to what was happening in the process. You know, like when you're painting outside, you're reacting to what you're observing. And these kind of became more I don't know if psychological is the word, but just more driven by a certain thoughts and emotions and things that I was thinking about and reading at the time that relate to the, you know, the outdoors and the environment. And some of them are, you know, maybe a little, you know, a little edgy, or, you know, there's one called The Little Black Cloud. And, you know, it's just, I was just thinking about the environment a lot and how it's changing. But I love how the colors in both our works and the edges and the shapes relate. And there's sort of a construction of shapes and genes, and I'm sort of, I don't know, pulling apart the landscape into shapes. You know, like he's building up his pieces, and I'm sort of disassembling these landscapes that I spent time painting. But they all started as fairly naturalistic looking landscapes, if you can believe that. They're very abstract, some of them.
So
I,
can you talk a bit about your process? So, you know, I imagine you have lots of bits and pieces in your studio. So when you start one, do you have an idea or do you have pieces that you just start putting together, or is it both?
well, when I did woodcuts, I did black and white woodcuts. So working with color is something relatively new for me, and I find all my colors, and I've been using old traffic signs and hand painted wooden signs, which are very kind of geometric. And I take like tracing paper and I start working with tracing a little piece on a sign and whatever, and then I kind of go from there. I just keep adding shapes that relate to each other, maybe colors that relate to each other. Um, but I don't paint the signs and things. Um, I'm working with colors that I've found. I rarely maybe will paint an edge or something with some watercolor to kind of blend in a raw cut edge. But I'm always working with found colors, and even, you know, all my shapes are kind of found. They may not look like signs. I try to disguise them so that they don't look real obvious. But um, I just I'm interested in those shapes, those simple shapes, and that's kind of what I start with. And I cut things apart and then I put things back together. Um, I like shadow box kind of things. For a while, I was doing some shadow box things. I do themes, and I'll do 3 or 4 assemblages, and then I'll go back and I'll start something else, and I'll do another 3 or 4, and they kind of build one on, you know, one on each other. And I used to do that with my prints too. I'll do a number of drawings and then I'll do a number of prints. I'll do a number of drawings for the assemblages, and then I'll pick out the best drawings and I'll do a number of assemblages. So I kind of work and that's kind of evident, I think, if you look closely at the work on the wall. You see a lot of round shapes. That was my round period. I started out like the ones you're looking at now. I started out with these round metal disc uh, circles, and I tried to stay within the parameter of the shape, and that didn't last very long. It suddenly started to go out of the circle, and now I rarely work. I might start with the circle, but I end up oftentimes where you don't really see the circle anymore because I can't stay in the lines. Um, so, but I really enjoy what I do. I see things. I like putting different things together. Um, some of these have pieces of old farm machinery that was horse drawn. Um, when they um, put farm machinery with screws and bolts, it wasn't welded together. The farm machinery was decorated with pinstripes often. They put their names on it in another color. Um, I kind of trying to honor that some of that old technology where I use screws that have a straight slot rather than Phillips head slots. Um,
Yeah, there's a
just
speaking of
putting new life to old things.
speaking of the assembly part, so a lot of them do seem screwed together.
Yeah, yeah, most of them are screwed together, or because I've been to wooden boat school for a number of years, and the boats we build or the boats that I work on in Maine are the ones that are more traditionally made, and they were riveted together with
Mm.
copper rivets. And every once in a while, I use copper rivets to rivet my pieces together, or iron rivets. Pieces get riveted together. Um, and just a natural way for me to do that rather than kind of glue things together or use a air nailer to kind of nail them together. Um, I have a whole collection of very small screws, and I screw them together or I rivet them together. Um,
It
just
seems a very
big
methodical
fasteners.
process.
Excuse me.
It seems a very methodical process to screw them like this because they're evenly spaced.
Well, yeah, and maybe sometimes too evenly spaced. I this last little while I kind of eyeball things together. They have a little more loose quality to them, I guess, because maybe they aren't quite so precise. Um, but I think that preciseness, the kind of the precision, comes from the woodworking.
I'm
You know,
sure.
always very careful when joints went together. Things miters and even butt joints had a fit just as you know, absolutely as good as I could possibly make them. Um, and, you know, when the painters came in and wanted to caulk things, I had to run around and stop them from doing that because if something needed to be caulked or a joint needed to be fixed, I didn't want it fixed with caulk. I was the guy that wanted to fix the joint. So, um, there are a lot of people uh, in some of the newer houses, everything gets caulked. They caulk all the joints, and I just, I just don't want that done. I built a new house 20 years ago, and the painter went around and I don't know whether he even used one tube of caulk because I wouldn't let him caulk hardly anything. And he said, "Well, that's not the way we do it now." I said, "That's the way I do it, and I don't want it caulked." So,
So Lou, you're painting on paper for the most part, right?
Many of them are, and I think this journey into the abstraction started with the fact that I started doing these oil paintings on this Arches oiled paper, if anyone's familiar with that. Some of them are on panel or linen panel. Um,
So
but
what's the appeal of paper over canvas or panel?
well, I like a lot of artists, I'm constantly frustrated with my work, which I think is a good sign. And one thing about my plein air landscapes is I always preferred my works on paper. They were my drawings and watercolors. they always felt freer and more abstracted. I felt like when I was painting the landscape with oils, I just wasn't getting the same effect. So I don't know whether it was consciously thought of or if I just bought a block of this Arches oil paper, but immediately it became a transition from watercolor to using oil on paper, and this paper reacts a little bit like as if you're working with watercolors. It's super absorbent, and it's anyway. Many of the paintings that I started doing with the oil on the paper, I started leaving more of the white of the paper. I was having more transparent areas, and I was just able to do more work without worrying, because as most artists say, you know, you kind of get like precious in front of a canvas or a piece of linen, and the paper was, I was treating it more like I treat my sketches, and I have mountains and mountains of sketches because I just, when I go out to paint, especially if it's in the winter or if I don't have a lot of time, um, you know, I'll often work on paper because, you know, it's just a shorter amount of time than setting up the easel and the whole plein air process. So,
Do you use photographs at all?
I use photographs on my phone to remember where I was. And I do occasionally use photographs for a reference. And, you know, photography can be useful and also for abstracting, but I don't, the main reason I don't paint from photographs is I sort of have this outdoor disease. I have to be outside most of the time. I really don't like painting in a studio unless there's a blizzard outside. And of course, we're not getting enough snow lately. So, um, you know, it's
So
hard
the
to.
plein air painting, I mean, when you're outside, you're there for a limited time under certain light conditions, so you don't have a lot of time to finish. So do you return to a site repeatedly, or do you get it started, then take it to the studio and finish
Well,
it there?
yeah, this one that you have up, they're small, like these are quite small. So my attempt would always be to finish the small ones because it would honestly be as much about the experience as
Ah,
creating something, because um, I just love the experience of being outside. And this is a good way to be outside if you're not hiking or doing something else. So I try to not go back into them. This larger ones, and most of the ones in the show are not ones where I would plan to go back. I
hmm.
have done larger plein airs where I uh, do a lot of drawings, do a lot of sketchings, then go back to the same site and, you know, kind of traditionally block in, um, especially if it was a piece of architecture, complicated architecture. I'd block in the drawing on the canvas, kind of paint a drawing in with the canvas with an underpainting, and then go back like a third or fourth time. So I do that with larger works, but these all started as like that's one that was started on paper. Most of them in the show are on paper, and the intention was to just do them in one shot. But what happened with these works is I'd come back and have all these works, like, you know, piles of paintings, and they weren't all, in my opinion, resolved. Like very few paintings, you know, it's a little more common that they're not resolved outside. So I'll bring them in the studio and start playing around with them. And and then a few years ago, I noticed I was really pushing things to become um, much more flattened, and I was playing around with the colors more. And then sometimes the whole original um, plein air experience was painted over, and it started to become something else. It started to become about something in my head. And I just started inventing more. So this show, like the show has like ones in different stages where there's a couple in the show that were done on site and not touched afterwards. Like the one on the far left, on my far left of the blue houses there, that was done on site and I never touched it afterwards. It was done outside, the whole painting. I never went back into it. So I wanted to have a few examples in the show of, this is this is what it was like, like I was standing there painting and I didn't touch it. But most of them in the show were reworked. And so I don't know. I mean, this isn't realistic, but it's also not entirely abstracted.
Yeah,
But
I think it straddles the line.
oh, okay,
Yeah,
good.
between the two.
Okay.
You definitely have like a sense of natural light and air, but you're also very much aware of like the structure of the painting. It's
Yeah,
kind of
the buildings
abstract
have,
quality. Yeah.
yeah, the buildings have some dimension. And I think sometimes like shadows, like that one has a pretty hard shadow. The shadows were really excuses to make shapes. When I'm outside, I'm really drawn to architecture with bold shadows. So many of them start that way.
So it's interesting. So Lou, you're more comfortable being outside, but then Jean, you'd be pretty much studio person strictly. Like, so is it like your sanctuary, your studio?
I didn't hear the last part. I'm sorry.
So would you consider your studio like your sanctuary where you work on everything? Because you lose plein air and comfortable outside, but you're definitely an inside.
Yeah, my work going from the prints, which was like Lou, I rarely took photographs. I only took a photograph, just like Lou said, as this is where I was that day. Um, because I really like working from the drawings. There's just something that's different working from a photograph from a drawing. Or, and I always like the drawing part. Um, but I have to work in my studio space now because I have so much stuff to pick.
Right.
I couldn't possibly carry it outside. And it also gives me a chance to kind of lay a lot of things out. And I sometimes work on two or three things at one time. Um, and that's why I say kind of one work kind of morphs right into the next work. Um, and so as the things get laid out, I'm picking things out of a number of different places and putting things back together. So yeah, I'm very much studio oriented now.
So seeing your work together this way, does it like make you think about your own work differently, or do you have thoughts about that, or do you have questions for each other about each other's work? I mean, because sometimes when you have a solo show of your own stuff, that's one way of looking at it. But then when you see it with another person, it sort of looks different. I'm interested to know your feelings about that.
I'd be curious, Jean, if you've ever had an urge to reference something um, where the viewer, I'm just curious, I'm not saying do this or try this. I'm just curious if you ever thought of uh, you know the viewers seeing something recognizable. Um, I don't know. I guess I'm curious because like my work doesn't start from, well, yours starts from pure shape and color. And I've never been able to do that. It might sound weird because a few of my pieces are almost totally non-objective, but I've never been able to work abstractly. And so how do you see these as abstractions, or it's more about the play of finding the pieces that will fit together? Like,
Yeah, that's hard to say because all my woodcuts, with the exception of three or four, were all realistic and they were all black and white. And now I've gone into color and abstract, so it's like 180-degree difference. Um, and It's like kind of playing catch up with color. I didn't use color for so many years. Now all of a sudden I'm using color and I'm using abstract shapes, and it's just become almost addictive. You know, I can't stay out of the studio. I go over there all the time. And I'm always working on stuff, and I'm always carrying a sketchbook, and I'm always like Lou in my woodcuts. I always like things that had real definite shadows, just because of the way the shadow shapes were, the way the shadows went on the flat surface or they went on a vertical surface. That was always absolutely fascinating to me, and um, so some of these I do sketches, like I say, wherever I go, when I see an interesting kind of shape combination that I wouldn't normally think about. When I go back to the studio, I often look in my sketchbooks and I find shapes that I find interesting. And then I try to find um, one of my signs or one of my pieces of rusty metal, um, and try to start with that. So it gives me kind of an in to get started on something. Sometimes I really struggle getting started, but once I get started, then I'm doing two or three things at one time. So
it sounds like the materials kind of lead you in a sense after a point, like,
yeah, the materials. Once I get two or three shapes, and um, maybe I'm only going to use four shapes. Once you get two or three, then the assemblage is kind of dictated by what you've started. So then, in some ways, it becomes easier to finish it or find that fourth shape, because the assemblage pretty much tells you, or at least tells me, that I need a color like this, and I need a shape like that, and maybe instead of a narrow kind of shape, I need a big bold shape. Um,
oh,
and
that sounds a little bit like constructing a painting, actually. I
Well,
think I'm just learning how
yeah, it
to
is.
work abstract.
Yeah, and it's like construction too. Like house construction or building something. Um, Oftentimes, like, houses are kind of big pieces of art. Um, is the way I look at them. You start with a foundation, you build on the foundation, you start adding the pieces, and well, when you're finished, you have a collection of shapes, different sizes, different colors, and I guess I look at some of my assemblages in a similar way. I'm, I'm building something, and I was always building something. I built things when I was a little kid. I was always putting blocks together. I was always sawing up wood. I was always getting nails out of my father's nail cans and making something, and using tools that I wasn't supposed to. And and so then I just became like a big kid And I have all this stuff now, and I have my own tools, and I can do whatever I want. It's just, like I say, it's addictive. It's just purely addictive. I just can't wait to get there in the morning and get started.
That's great.
That's a good addiction to have.
Very.
Yeah, yeah.
So Lou, I have a question for you.
Oh,
That I wanted to mention the surface quality of your painting. It seems particularly important to you, like the paint handling, the stroke, the texture. They're very beautiful surfaces in and of themselves.
oh, thank you. I think these are, there's a lot of play and just a lot of joy and pleasure in building up and, now that I think of it, it's constructing a space. And because some of them were reworked so much, I sand and I scrape and
So
um,
you apply the paint, then you take it off and apply it again, and then
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and even with the ones on paper, those, the paper becomes much less delicate. The oiled paper, the more paint that's applied, and I ended up grabbing different materials, and some of them some colored pencils and sharp objects, and sort of creating some hatching in some of them and texture. And I love this one, has a lot of palette knife. I used a lot of palette knife in that. And yeah, so uh, and I've got to say that working on this series, and there's more than what are in the show, um it then affected, it became like a full circle. It affected my work when I went back out into the landscape. So, and I'd like to explore that even more, like this kind of mark making. Um, there were things I man, I don't know if I was afraid. I was just felt like a lot of artists is one way to do things, uh, and trying to be too traditional. But I feel freer now in my plein air landscapes, the ones that are more realistic. I don't know, stop it. And to go back into them and use um, some of the techniques and experimenting that I've done in these abstract ones. And there's one in the show that I did this summer, that just turned out very, very abstract. It's the one closest to the entrance, and it's and I think it partly had to do with going to Newfoundland, and it's sort of like everything came together. Yeah, it's that one at the end. Like there was something about Newfoundland that I've wanted to go there almost my entire life since I was a teenager. Well, I got as far as Nova Scotia, and it was such a long drive to Nova Scotia. So I stayed in Nova Scotia, like it's been over 30 years now. But I finally, this late in life, got to Newfoundland, and it just it just was everything I could wish for. It's just like the structures in the land, the rocks, the rock formations. So this was actually a plein air, um, and it actually looked like that. I mean, there's just these crazy rocks. I mean, one place I went to was actually called Mad Rocks, and they were mad rocks. I mean, they were just these absolutely phenomenal structures that happened in the earth so long ago. So this is a plein air painting, and I did not touch it afterwards. And so I think, I mean, just to go back to what I was saying, like things I think have come full circle, and I hope that'll happen more. Like the experimenting inside the studio let me experiment outside while I was painting and try to not be a slave to reality, to use that expression. So I don't know if any of that made sense, but it's very excited in Newfoundland. I mean, I feel kind of spoiled now. I'm not going to know where to paint.
So you're gonna go back to Newfoundland next
Yes.
year?
Yeah, it's really far though. It's really far away,
Mhm.
very far. But
Well, thank you, Gina and Lou, for a wonderful show.
thank you for
Yeah, thank you for
inviting us and having us. Really, it's a beautiful gallery, and
yeah,
really
our
thankful.
things look good before, but when you put them in the gallery, they
Yeah,
really look
yeah.
nice. They really do. So
Yeah,
yeah,
you've really installed it beautifully.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the show is up through November 24th. We hope people come down to see it. And everything's also available on our website, ceruleanarts.com. And thanks again, Gina and Lou, for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks everyone who's watching.
All right, take care and have a good night.
Bye.
Yeah. Good night.